Ambassador Velthrix sat alone in his office on the great station of the Galactic Council. The lights were dim. The air was cool. Before him floated a holographic display showing a small blue planet called Earth. He had watched the recordings 100 times. He had read the reports 1,000 times. And still, the same cold feeling ran through his body every time he studied the species called humans. 300 years ago, the Galactic Council had first detected signals from this small world. At first, there was excitement. A new species was always a cause for celebration. The galaxy was vast and often lonely. Finding new friends was a gift. But then the Council began to study humanity more closely. What they found made them afraid. Velthrix pressed a button, and the hologram changed. It showed ancient humans fighting each other with stones and sticks. It showed them hunting great beasts, until none remained. It showed them building weapons of fire and metal. It showed them dropping bombs that could destroy entire cities. The Council had a word for species like this. They called them Ruthless. Velthrix had been a young diplomat when humanity finally built ships that could travel faster than light. He remembered the emergency meetings. He remembered the fear in everyone's voices. What would happen when these ruthless creatures entered the galaxy? Would they conquer? Would they destroy? Would they bring their endless wars to peaceful worlds? The debate lasted 50 years. Some wanted to destroy Earth before humans could spread. Others wanted to hide and hope the humans never found them. In the end, the Council chose a middle path. They would make contact. They would offer humanity a place in the Galactic Accord. But they would watch them very, very carefully. Velthrix stood up and walked to his window. Outside, the great station stretched for miles in every direction. Ships from 100 different species came and went. The luminari glided past in their crystal vessels. Beings of pure light and emotion. The massive cargo haulers of the Vorthax hegemony moved slowly toward the trading docks. A swarm of tiny Melisari ships danced around each other like insects. And far away, kept at a safe distance from the main station, sat the human sector. The humans had their own docking area, their own quarters, their own trading posts. They were members of the Galactic Accord, but they were not truly welcome. No human ship was allowed near the core worlds. No human diplomat could enter the main council chambers without an escort of security drones. No human merchant could trade directly with most species. The galaxy did not trust them. The galaxy remembered their files. Velthrix thought about the last time he had spoken with a human. It was a trade negotiation, nothing important. The human had been polite, professional. She had smiled and made small jokes. She had agreed to fair terms without argument, and yet, Velthrix had felt something strange the entire time. A tension in the air. A sense that behind those soft eyes and friendly words, something dangerous was waiting, something that could explode at any moment. That was the thing about humans. They seemed so normal on the surface. They laughed. They cried. They loved their families and told stories and made art, but underneath all of that, they carried something dark, something the Luminari called the predator frequency. The Luminari were beings of pure empathic energy. They could feel the emotions of other species. Most civilized races had calm emotional patterns, gentle waves of feeling that rose and fell like peaceful oceans. But humans were different. Human emotions were intense, chaotic. The Luminari said it was like standing next to a fire that could burn out of control at any moment. They refused to even enter the same system as large groups of humans. The experience was too overwhelming. Velthrix returned to his desk and continued reading the latest reports on human activity. They had been busy these past few centuries. They had colonized dozens of worlds in the outer reaches. They had built stations in asteroid belts and on barren moons. They had created their own small corner of the galaxy, far from everyone else. The strange thing was that they never complained. Other species in their position would have demanded better treatment. They would have protested. They would have threatened. But the humans just accepted their place and kept working. They traded fairly. They kept their promises. They followed the rules of the Galactic Accord. They asked for nothing. Some members of the Council saw this as proof that humans could be trusted. Perhaps they had changed. Perhaps they had left their violent past behind. But Velthrix was not so sure. He had studied human history too carefully. He knew that humans were patient. He knew that humans could wait for the right moment. He knew that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one that seemed calm. A message appeared on his screen. It was from High Counselor Meridax, the leader of the Galactic Council. There was to be a meeting tomorrow. Something about a new trade agreement with a frontier species. Velthrix closed the message without reading the details. His mind was still on the humans. He pulled up more files. This time, he looked at human art, human music, human stories. He had always found these fascinating. For such a violent species, humans created beautiful things. Their paintings showed both war and peace. Their songs spoke of both hatred and love. Their stories were full of heroes who sacrificed everything for others. This was the contradiction that Velthrix could never understand. How could the same species that invented nuclear weapons also write poems about kindness? How could the same creatures that hunted their own planet's great beasts to extinction also risk their lives to save strangers? He thought about the human concept of heroism. Many species had similar ideas, but humans took it to an extreme. In human stories, the hero was often someone who died saving others. This was seen as the greatest possible act, the most noble thing a person could do. Velthrix found this disturbing. It suggested that humans had a strange relationship with death. They feared it, yes, but they also seemed willing to embrace it for the right cause. What kind of species celebrated dying for others? What kind of species saw self-destruction as heroic? A ruthless one, Velthrix thought. A species that would stop at nothing once it decided something was important. He closed the files and turned off his display. The office fell into darkness. Tomorrow, he would attend the council meeting. He would discuss trade agreements and diplomatic matters. He would smile and be polite. But tonight, he would think about humans. He would wonder what they were really planning out there in the outer reaches. He would ask himself the same question that had haunted the galaxy for 300 years. What would happen when the ruthless ones finally showed their true nature? Outside his window, the galaxy continued to turn. Ships came and went. Species that had been civilized for millions of years went about their peaceful lives. And far away, in the forgotten corners of space, the humans kept building, kept growing, kept waiting. No one knew what they were waiting for. No one knew what would finally make them show their true face, but everyone was afraid to find out. The distress signal came at midnight, Council Standard Time. It started as a weak pulse from the outer reaches, a small agricultural world called Ketha 7. At first, the communication officers thought it was a technical problem. Signals from the frontier were often unclear, but then the message became stronger, and then everyone understood. This is Governor Kethmul of Ketha 7. We are facing total planetary destruction. A gravitational anomaly has destabilized our planet's core. We have 40 million citizens. We have 72 hours. Please, someone help us. High Counselor Meridax was woken from his sleep by his assistant. Within an hour, he had called an emergency session of the Galactic Council. Representatives from all major species gathered in the Great Hall. The air was thick with tension and fear. The scientists spoke first. They explained what was happening to Ketha 7. A rogue gravitational wave had passed through the system. No one knew where it came from. Such things were rare but not impossible in the chaos of space. The wave had struck the planet at exactly the wrong angle. It had cracked something deep inside the world. Now the planet was dying. The core was becoming unstable. In 72 hours, Ketha 7 would tear itself apart. Every living thing on the surface would die. What can we do? Meridax asked. The answer was simple but terrifying. They needed to evacuate 40 million Kethari before the planet exploded. This required thousands of ships, massive cargo vessels, transport carriers, anything that could hold living beings. The problem was time, and distance, and danger. Ketha 7 was far from the core worlds. The gravitational chaos was already spreading through the system. Ships that entered would face terrible risks. Some would not survive. Meridax looked around the Great Hall. He saw representatives from 847 species. These were the civilized peoples of the galaxy, the enlightened ones, the peaceful ones. Surely, they would help. I am sending a formal request for aid, he announced. This is a crisis that affects us all. We must show that the Galactic Accord means something. We must show that we protect each other. The request went out on all diplomatic frequencies. It reached every member species within minutes. And then Meridax waited. The first response came from the Luminari. Their ambassador appeared as a shimmer of light in the center of the hall. His voice was soft and full of sorrow. We feel the suffering of the Kethari, he said. Their fear reaches us even across the vast distance. Our hearts weep for them. But we cannot send our vessels into such unstable conditions. Our crystalline ships are too fragile. We would lose them all. We offer our prayers and our deepest sympathy." The Luminari representative faded away. Next came the Vorthax hegemony. Their ambassador was a massive creature with gray skin and cold eyes. He spoke in a flat, mechanical voice. "We have calculated the risks. Ship loss probability is 23%. This is unacceptable. Our vessels serve the hegemony. We will not sacrifice them for beings who are not our own. We decline the request." One by one, the responses came in. Each was different, but the answer was always the same. The Melisari swarm was engaged in a territorial dispute on their border. They could not spare any ships. The crystalline minds entered what they called a contemplative cycle. They needed to consider the philosophical implications of the situation. This would take several weeks. The Voreni collective expressed concern about the precedent. If they helped now, would they be expected to help every time there was a disaster? Where would it end? The Thalketh Empire was willing to help, but only if someone else went first. They did not want to take the risk alone. The hours passed. 68 hours remained, then 64, then 60. Meridax watched the communication logs with growing horror. He saw species that had been civilized for millions of years, species that spoke constantly about peace and wisdom and the value of life, and none of them would send a single ship. They sent prayers. They sent sympathy. They sent thoughts and wishes and hopes. But not ships. Never ships. On Ketha 7, the ground was beginning to crack. Buildings shook. The sky turned dark with ash from volcanoes that had woken after centuries of sleep. 40 million Kethari looked up at the stars and waited for rescue. No rescue came. Meridax felt something he had not felt in a long time. Shame. Deep, burning shame. This was supposed to be a civilized galaxy. This was supposed to be a community of enlightened beings, and when one member faced death, the others simply watched. There were 56 hours left when his assistant approached with a strange expression. "High Counselor," she said. "There is a new signal." It is not from any council member." "What do you mean?" "It is from the humans." Meridax felt his body go cold. The humans. The ruthless ones. The species that everyone feared. What did they want? Were they going to take advantage of this disaster somehow? He opened the communication channel. The message was broadcast on an old military frequency. It was not encrypted. It was not diplomatic. It was just raw and direct. "This is Admiral Chen Wei of the Terran Emergency Response Coalition. We heard your distress signal. We are coming. Our estimated arrival time is 16 hours. Hold on. Help is coming." For a long moment, no one in the council chamber spoke. The representatives looked at each other in confusion. The humans were coming? The humans were helping? "This must be a trick," someone said. "The humans want something. They always want something. Perhaps they plan to take the Kethari as slaves," another suggested. "Or use them as hostages." But Meridax was looking at the data attached to the message. The humans were not sending 1 or 2 ships. According to the numbers, they were sending over 300 vessels, 300 ships, racing toward a dying planet, ready to face the gravitational chaos that every civilized species had refused to enter. Why? What did the humans gain from this? What was their plan? Meridax did not know. But for the first time in 300 years, he wondered if the galaxy had made a mistake about the species called humanity. On Ketha 7, Governor Kethmul received the same message. She read it 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. The humans, the monsters from the old files, the ruthless ones who scared everyone. They were the only ones coming. She walked outside and looked up at the dark sky. The ground shook beneath her feet. Her people were crying and praying and preparing to die. But somewhere out there, in the cold darkness of space, 300 human ships were burning their engines at maximum power, racing toward a planet that was not their own, coming to save people they had never met. Governor Kethmul did not understand. Nothing in the files had prepared her for this. Ruthless species did not save strangers. Ruthless species did not risk everything for people who had treated them as outcasts. She went back inside to tell her people. Help was coming. Against all logic and reason, help was coming. And it was coming from the species everyone had been afraid of all along. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel like thunder. 318 ships appeared in the space above Ketha 7. They came in all shapes and sizes. There were military cruisers with their weapons powered down and their cargo bays opened wide. There were old cargo haulers that looked like they should have been retired decades ago. There were mining vessels with their drill assemblies removed to make room for passengers. And there were stranger ships, too. Civilian passenger liners that had dumped their luxury furniture into space to create more room. Private yachts owned by wealthy humans who had demanded to join the rescue. Small transport ships that normally carried goods between human colonies. It was not a proper fleet. It was a mess. It was chaos. It was everything the humans could find that could fly and carry living beings. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Indomitable Spirit. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She had not slept in 30 hours. She did not plan to sleep until this was over. All ships, report status, she ordered. The responses came in one after another. Engines running hot but stable. Shields at maximum power. Crews ready. Every ship was prepared to fly into hell. The planet below them was dying. Even from space, they could see the cracks spreading across the surface. Volcanoes were erupting everywhere. The atmosphere was filled with ash and fire. Gravitational waves rippled through the system, shaking every vessel. A normal fleet would have waited for the chaos to calm down. A normal commander would have calculated the safest approach. But Admiral Chen Wei knew they did not have time for normal. All ships, begin descent. Rescue operations start now. The fleet broke apart and dove toward the planet. Immediately, the gravitational waves hit them. 2 frigates were caught in a massive surge. Their captains had only seconds to make a decision. All hands to evacuation pods, ordered Captain Williams of the frigate Bright Hope. I'm going to use our ship as a shield for the transports behind us. His crew escaped. Captain Williams did not. He rode his dying ship down, keeping its bulk between the deadly gravity waves and the slower civilian ships. The Bright Hope broke apart 3 minutes later. Captain Williams became the first human to die that day. He would not be the last. On the surface, the Kethari watched the sky with fear and wonder. Ships were falling through the ash clouds. Human ships, dozens of them, hundreds of them. The first landing craft touched down in the capital city. The doors opened and humans came running out. They wore environment suits to protect them from the poisonous air. They carried medical supplies and food and water. A human officer found Governor Ketha standing in the ruins of her government building. He was a tall man with dark skin and a calm voice. Governor, I'm Lieutenant Commander Jackson. We're here to evacuate your people. Where should we start? Ketha stared at him. She had spent her whole life hearing stories about humans. Terrible stories, frightening stories. And now one was standing in front of her, asking how he could help. The children, she managed to say. The schools. There are thousands of children in the Eastern District. Jackson nodded and spoke into his communicator. Within minutes, a dozen landing craft were heading toward the Eastern District. Within an hour, the first children were being loaded onto ships. The humans worked with terrifying efficiency. They had done this before, Ketha realized. Not on this scale, perhaps, but they had trained for disasters. They had prepared for exactly this kind of nightmare. Teams spread out across the planet. They set up evacuation zones in every major city. They organized the Kethari into groups. They carried the elderly and the sick. They calmed the frightened children with gentle words and soft touches. The ground shook constantly now. Buildings collapsed every few minutes. But the humans kept working. When one path was blocked, they found another. When one ship was full, another took its place. In the southern farmlands, a young Kethari girl named Sethka became separated from her family. She was only 6 years old. The ground opened up beneath her feet and she found herself trapped on a small island of rock, surrounded by a river of fire. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez saw her from across the chasm. There was a narrow bridge of rock that might hold a person's weight. The ground was shaking. The bridge could collapse at any moment. Rodriguez did not hesitate. She ran across the bridge, feeling it crack beneath her boots. She reached Sethka and picked her up in her arms. She turned to run back. The bridge collapsed. Rodriguez threw Sethka with all her strength. The child flew through the air and landed on solid ground, crying but safe. Rodriguez fell into the fire below. They found her body 3 hours later. She was still holding her rescue beacon. She had activated it so that the rescue teams would not waste time looking for her. Even in death, she was trying to help the mission. Admiral Chen Wei received the report on her bridge. Another name added to the list. Another human gone. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and continued giving orders. There was no time for grief. There would be time later. Right now, there were still millions of Kethari waiting to be saved. The hours passed. The planet continued to die, and the humans continued to work. They flew their ships through conditions that should have been impossible. They walked through fire and poison and chaos. They carried children on their backs and pushed elderly Kethari in makeshift wheelchairs. They gave their own food and water to refugees who had none. When a massive earthquake struck the northern continent, 3 human ships were caught on the ground. Their engines were damaged. They could not take off. The captains did not panic. They transferred their passengers to other ships, one shuttle at a time. It took 4 hours. The earthquake was getting worse every minute, but they did not leave until every single Kethari was safe. Only then did they try to escape themselves. 2 of the captains made it. 1 did not. By the 30-hour mark, more than half the population had been evacuated. The human ships were making continuous runs between the surface and the fleet above. Some ships had made the trip a dozen times. Their crews were exhausted. Their engines were failing, but they kept going. A cargo ship called the Endless Mercy lost its main engine during descent. It began to fall toward the surface, carrying 3,000 Kethari refugees. The captain, a woman named Sarah Chen, managed to restart the backup engine at the last moment. The ship crashed, but it crashed slowly. Everyone survived the landing, but the ship could not take off again, and there were no other vessels close enough to help. Captain Chen organized her passengers and crew. They began walking toward the nearest evacuation zone. It was 50 kilometers away. The air was poison. The ground was shaking. Half the refugees could barely walk. It took them 8 hours. Captain Chen carried a Kethari child on her back the entire way. When they finally reached the evacuation zone, she collapsed from exhaustion. She woke up on a medical ship 3 hours later. The first thing she asked was whether all her passengers had made it. They had. Every single one. Above the planet, Admiral Chen Wei watched the numbers on her screen. 30 million evacuated. 35 million. 38 million. The planet was dying faster now. They had maybe 10 hours left. Maybe less. We're going to make it, she said quietly. We're going to save them all. And somehow, impossibly, she was right. The last ship lifted off from Ketha 7 with 43 minutes to spare. It was a small transport called the Little Star. It carried 217 Kethari refugees and a crew of 12 humans. The pilot, a young man named David Park, had made 9 trips to the surface. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. His vision was blurry. But he guided the ship up through the ash and fire and chaos, and he did not stop until they reached the safety of space. Behind them, Ketha 7 died. The planet tore itself apart in a silent explosion of rock and fire. Great chunks of stone flew out into space. The atmosphere was ripped away in seconds. A world that had been home to 40 million souls simply ceased to exist. On the bridge of the indomitable spirit, Admiral Chen Wei watched the destruction with tired eyes. Around her, her crew was silent. Some were crying. Some were praying. Some were just staring at the screens, unable to look away. Final count, Chen Wei ordered quietly. Her communications officer checked the numbers 3 times before speaking. His voice was hoarse from hours of shouting orders. 40 million Kethari evacuated. Admiral, every single one. No refugees lost. A wave of relief passed through the bridge. They had done it. Against all odds, against every calculation, they had saved everyone. But the communications officer was not finished. We lost 17 ships. Total human casualties are 2,847. Chen Wei closed her eyes. Nearly 3,000 humans. Mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and lovers, all gone. She thought about Captain Williams, who had used his ship as a shield. She thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had thrown a child to safety before falling into fire. She thought about all the others whose names she did not yet know. They had come here as volunteers. Every single one of them had known the risks. They had left behind families and homes and safe lives to fly into a gravitational nightmare and save strangers. And nearly 3,000 of them would never go home. Send the casualty list to Earth Command, Chen Wei ordered. And prepare a memorial service for tomorrow. We will honor our dead. The human fleet began the slow journey toward the nearest station. Their ships were damaged and exhausted. Many were barely holding together, but they had completed their mission. Behind them, where a planet used to be, there was only dust and rubble. The Galactic Council received the news within hours. High Counselor Meridax read the reports with a mixture of amazement and shame. The humans had done the impossible. They had saved 40 million lives, and they had paid for it with their own blood. Meridax could not understand the mathematics. The humans had no treaty with the Kethari. They had no economic relationship. They gained nothing from this rescue except dead crew members and damaged ships. Why? Why would any species sacrifice so much for strangers? He was not the only one asking this question. The Luminari had observed the rescue from a safe distance. They had watched the human ships dive into the chaos. They had felt the emotions of the human crews through their empathic senses. What they had found confused them deeply. The Luminari ambassador appeared before the council with a strange look on his glowing face. He seemed almost disturbed. "We tried to read the emotional signatures of the human rescuers," he explained. "We expected to find fear, stress, trauma, the normal feelings that any being would have after such a terrible experience." "And what did you find?" Meridax asked. The ambassador paused for a long moment. "Satisfaction," he finally said. "A deep, quiet satisfaction. And pride. Not arrogance or superiority. Something different. Something I do not have words for. They are not mourning their dead? They are mourning. But it is not the grief we expected. They seem to believe that their dead achieved something great. Something honorable. Each life lost is seen as a gift that saved others." Meridax tried to understand this. In his culture, death was always a tragedy. The loss of life was always a failure. But the humans seemed to see it differently. He thought about the human concept of heroism that Ambassador Velthrix had studied. The idea that dying for others was noble. The belief that sacrifice was the highest form of love. Perhaps this was what the Luminari were sensing. Not madness or cruelty, but a strange and terrible kind of love. At the refugee station, the Kethari survivors were beginning to process what had happened. They had lost their world, their homes, everything they had ever known. But they were alive. A Kethari elder named Velsheth approached a group of human medics who were treating the wounded. He was an old man who had lived on Ketha 7 for 90 years. Now he had nothing except the clothes on his back. "I must thank you," he said to a human doctor. "You saved us. You saved all of us." The doctor looked up from his patient. He was young, maybe 30 years old. His face was pale with exhaustion and there were dark circles under his eyes. "You don't need to thank us," he said simply. "We were close enough to help. That's all that matters. But your people died for us. So many of your people died." The doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, they did. And they would do it again. Every single one of them would make the same choice." Velsheth did not understand. "Why? We are strangers. We are not your people." The doctor smiled a small, sad smile. "That's not how we see it. When someone calls for help, they become our people. That's just how it works." He turned back to his patient, and Velsheth walked away more confused than ever. Admiral Chenwei never made it to the memorial service. Her shuttle had suffered engine failure during the final stages of the evacuation. She had been transferring refugees to another ship when the problems began. The shuttle was losing altitude fast. There was no time for everyone to escape. Chenwei had ordered her crew to transfer the last of the refugees using emergency tethers. It was dangerous work. The shuttle was shaking apart. The atmosphere was tearing at the hull. But one by one, the Kethari refugees were pulled to safety. A mother with 2 children, an elderly couple holding hands, a young man who had lost his entire family. Chenwei had 90 seconds left when the last refugee crossed the tether. She could have tried to follow. The tether was still connected. She might have made it. Instead, she stayed at the controls, keeping the dying shuttle stable so that the rescue ship could pull away safely. When her shuttle finally broke apart, she was still at her post. They found her body floating in space 2 days later. Her hands were still on the controls. The memorial service was held without her. Captain Morrison, now the ranking human officer, gave the speech. Admiral Chenwei was not supposed to be on this mission, he said to the assembled crowd. She was 63 years old. She was supposed to be retired. But when the call came, she was the first one to volunteer. Because that's who she was. That's who we all are. He paused, looking out at the faces of the surviving crew. They were tired. They were sad. But they were not broken. We lost 2,847 people. Each one of them knew the risks. Each one of them chose to come anyway. And because of them, 40 million Kethari will live to see tomorrow. He raised his hand in a salute. We don't celebrate death, but we celebrate sacrifice. We celebrate the choice to put others before ourselves. Every person we lost today was a hero, and we will remember them. Always. The crowd saluted back. Humans and Kethari together, honoring the fallen. Far away, on the Galactic Council station, Ambassador Velthrix watched a recording of the service. He saw the humans standing straight and proud despite their grief. He saw the Kethari refugees crying with gratitude, and for the first time, he began to question everything he thought he knew about the species called humanity. High Counselor Meridax requested a private meeting with the ranking human officer. Captain Yuki Tanaka agreed without hesitation. They met on the Kethari refugee station, in a small conference room overlooking the main evacuation center. Through the windows, they could see thousands of Kethari refugees being cared for by human volunteers. Medical teams were treating the wounded. Food was being distributed. Children were playing in a temporary recreation area. The humans had not stopped working. Even after the evacuation, even after losing so many of their own, they continued to help. Meridax studied Captain Tanaka as she entered the room. She was a woman of average height, with short black hair and eyes that seemed older than her face. She moved slowly, clearly exhausted, but she still carried herself with quiet dignity. "Thank you for meeting with me," Meridax said. "I know this is a difficult time." Tanaka nodded and sat down across from him. "What can I do for you, Counselor?" Meridax hesitated. He had prepared a speech. He had practiced formal diplomatic language, but looking at this tired woman who had just lost so many friends, he found he could not use any of it. "I need to understand," he said simply. "Why did you come? You knew the dangers. You had no obligation. Our own member species refused to help. Why did the humans answer?" Tanaka was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, they could hear the distant sounds of children laughing. Kethari children who were alive because humans had come for them. "You've read our history," she finally said. "You know what we've done. The wars, the massacres, the bombs we dropped on our own cities." Meridax nodded slowly. He knew the files by heart. Every species in the galaxy looked at those files and saw monsters, Tanaka continued. And maybe they weren't wrong. We can be monsters. We've proven that again and again throughout our history. We know exactly how dark we can become, because we've seen it. We've been it. She paused, her eyes distant. But that's exactly why we answer calls like this. Because we know what happens when nobody comes. We know what it costs when people decide that someone else's problem isn't worth the risk. We've seen the graves. We've counted the bodies. We've lived with the guilt. Meridax thought about the council meeting. He thought about all the species that had refused to help, the prayers they had offered instead of ships, the sympathy they had sent instead of crews. Your civilized species were able to say no because they've never failed like we have, Tanaka said. They've never experienced the shame of watching people die because they didn't act in time. They calculated the risks and decided it wasn't worth it. They made a logical choice, and humans don't make logical choices. Tanaka smiled slightly. It was a sad smile, tired and knowing. We try, but when someone is screaming for help in the darkness, logic stops working. Something older takes over, something that doesn't care about calculations or acceptable losses. We just move. We just go. We figure out the cost later. She gestured toward the window, toward the refugees. You call us ruthless, and maybe that's true. But our ruthlessness isn't about hurting people. It's about refusing to stop. When we decide something matters, when we decide someone matters, we don't give up. We keep going until the job is done, or we run out of people to send. Meridax considered this for a long time. The Galactic Council had spent 300 years studying human warfare, human cruelty, human capacity for destruction. They had cataloged every terrible thing humanity had ever done, but they had never studied human loyalty, human stubbornness, human willingness to die for strangers. We misunderstood, he said quietly. All this time, we thought ruthless meant cruel. Tanaka shook her head. No, Counselor. It means we don't know how to quit. It means when someone calls for help in the dark, we answer, not because we're brave, not because we're good, but because we can't imagine not answering, because leaving someone to die when we could have helped would destroy something inside us. She stood up and walked to the window. Below, a human medic was carrying a Ketha child on his shoulders, making the little girl laugh. Your species fear us because of what we might do to them. They remember our wars. They remember our bombs. They look at us and see the damage we could cause. She turned back to face Meridax, but they never asked what we might do for them. They never imagined that the same fire that makes us dangerous in war might also make us unstoppable in rescue. The same stubbornness that makes us keep fighting might also make us keep helping. Meridax thought about the files again. The same human species that had invented nuclear weapons had also invented international aid organizations. The same creatures that had hunted their own animals to extinction had also created nature preserves to protect the survivors. The same history that was full of massacres was also full of rescues. Humanity was not one thing. It was a contradiction. A species that could be monsters and heroes at the same time. That could destroy and save with equal determination. What happens now? Meridax asked. Tanaka shrugged. We keep helping. The Kethari need homes. They need food and medicine and a place to rebuild their culture. We'll help with that as long as they need us. You expect nothing in return? We expect to sleep better at night knowing we did the right thing. That's enough. Meridax stood up and walked to the window himself. He watched the humans moving through the crowd of refugees. They were tired. They were grieving. But they kept working. I owe you an apology, he said. The entire council owes you an apology. We treated your species with fear and suspicion for 300 years. We kept you at arm's length. We assumed the worst about everything you did. Tanaka nodded but said nothing. And when 40 million lives were at stake, we offered prayers and sympathy and nothing else. We were too civilized to risk ourselves for strangers. Meridax's voice was heavy with shame. But you came. The ruthless ones came. We always come, Tanaka said simply. That's the part you never understood about us. The violence in our history isn't the whole story. It's not even the important part of the story. She pointed to the scene below. A human teenage boy was teaching a group of Kethari children a hand-clapping game. They were laughing together, despite everything. This is who we are. The helping, the caring, the refusing to abandon people when they need us most. The violence is what happens when we fail to be this, when we let fear and hate take over, instead of love. She looked at Meridax with eyes that held centuries of human sorrow and human hope. Every war in our history was a failure to be better. Every massacre was a moment when we forgot what we're supposed to be. But we keep trying. We keep failing and getting back up and trying again, because that's what ruthless really means. We don't quit. We don't stop. We keep reaching for something better, no matter how many times we fall. Meridax was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. The Galactic Council will hear of this. I will personally ensure that your species is no longer treated as outcasts. You have proven that you deserve a place among us. A real place. Tanaka smiled sadly. That's kind of you, counselor. But we didn't do this for acceptance. We did it because it was right. Whether the galaxy respects us or fears us, we'll keep answering when people call for help. That's just who we are. She walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. You spent 300 years afraid of what humans might do to the galaxy. Maybe it's time to ask a different question. Maybe it's time to wonder what we might do with the galaxy. What we might build. What we might protect. She opened the door. That's the ruthless truth, counselor. We're not here to conquer. We're here to help. And we don't know how to stop. She left the room. Through the window, Meridax watched her walk out into the refugee center and immediately start helping a family carry their belongings. For the first time in 300 years, the Galactic Council had seen the true face of humanity. Not the wars, not the bombs, not the destruction, just a tired woman carrying a stranger's luggage. Because that's what you do when someone needs help. Outside, the stars continued to shine. The galaxy continued to turn. And somewhere in the darkness, the humans continued to listen, waiting for the next call, ready to answer, always.